Hi, everybody. I'm Francesca Rossi. I work at IBM Research, and I'm the past president of AAAI. And I would like to welcome you to the AAAI panel discussion on AI perception versus reality. Before we get to the actual discussion, let me say more generally that, as you may be aware, AI capabilities have evolved significantly, very rapidly in the last few years, and also AI research as a consequence has evolved a lot. So to understand the evolution of AI research along many dimensions, who is doing the research, what topics is the research about, how AI research is conducted, and even the geopolitical scenarios, AAAI in March of this year published a report on the future of AI research, which covers 17 topics around the transformation in AI research. And for each one of them goes into details very succinctly, in 3 or 4 pages about the open challenges, the history, and the context of that topic. The study was conducted by 25 prominent researchers and supported also by a community survey with about almost 500 respondents. And it has been written in a very non-technical way, intentionally, to reach out to audiences that are not AI researchers, including experts of other disciplines, policymakers, funding agency, media, and also the general public. As I said, the report included 17 topics. One of the topics was the perception versus reality of AI. And this is what we are going to discuss today. Indeed, over the last 70 years of AI research, AI has produced a lot of new and important technology, but also many times these have generated some excessive hype. Like other technology, these hype trends have followed the general Gardner hype cycle categorization. And while, as I said, AI has been hyped also in the past, the current generative AI hype cycle is the first time that AI has been introduced to the majority of people of the world, which, of course, are less familiar with the technology, many of them, and so sometimes do not have the tools to understand the validity of many claims that are made about this technology. In fact, in the community survey of the report, of the AAAI report, we asked if the current perception of AI capabilities matches the reality, and 79% of the respondents disagreed or strongly disagreed. We also asked if the mismatch is hindering AI research, and 90% of the respondents agreed with this statement, saying that the direction of AI research are sometimes driven by the hype, that theoretical AI research is suffering as a result, and less students are interested in academic research. Overall, most respondents felt that the current perception of AI capability is overblown, and this is a real impact, having a real impact in the field, and we should find a way to educate people about the reality of AI. In fact, 74% of the respondents also said that there should be community-driven initiative to organize public debates on AI perception of a reality with video recordings to be made available to all. And so this is what we're doing right now. So let me introduce the panelists for this discussion. We have Rodney Brooks, Professor Emeritus of Robotics at MIT, co-founder and CTO of Robust AI, founder of iRobot, founder, chairman, and CTO of Rethink Robotics. Thanks, Rodney, for joining us. Then we have Tom Dietterich, Professor Emeritus of Oregon State University and former president of AAAI. Thanks, Tom. Gary Marcus, Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Neural Science at NYU and co-founder of Geometric Intelligence Robust AI. Thanks, Gary, for being here. And Peter Stone, Professor of Computer Science and Director of Robotics at UT Austin, study panel chair of the first report from a 100-year study of AI, and chief scientist of Sony AI. So let's start immediately with trying to eliminate some, give an idea of what is this perception of AI and possible hype around AI. So I'll start with Rodney. So there is a wide agreement, Rodney, the recent advances of AI has been accompanied by a heavy dose of hype. Can you explain what the hype is about? Is it about AI capabilities or AI risks or both or something else?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying this is not new. The current language models use neural models, and neural models have been around for a long time. And back in 1957, when Frank Rosenblatt had his first linear threshold neuron, just like we have today hundreds of billions in the language models, his report had on the cover introducing the perceptron. He only had one of these perceptrons, a machine which senses, recognizes, remembers, and responds like the human mind. And that was one neuron compared to the hundreds of billions we have today. So it was hype, and it's cycled. And I think there's two things going on with the current hype. One is that the confusion between performance and competence. The performance of the language models is astonishing to all of us. I think that's a fair thing to say. But people then believe that there's a competence, a generality behind that, which is equivalent to a human being. And I think that's one of the problems. The other problem is, Arthur C. Clarke said many years ago, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If you don't have a mental model of how it works, you don't know what the limitations are. So people go off in two directions. One direction is it's going to do everything, and us humans will be then be able to write poetry. Oh, except the LLMs are better at that than they are, and eat grapes. And the other direction is, oh, it's going to kill us, because we have no understanding of what the limitations are at the moment. So both sides are pushing too far.
Thanks, Rodney. Peter, Gary, or Thomas? Yes, Gary.
I'll add a little bit. Going back to the thing that Rod just mentioned in 1957, both the New Yorker and I believe the New York Times took it in hook, line, and sinker, and they had huge headlines about that. In fact, Rod might have actually been reading from one of those headlines, if I remember correctly. And so the media has been a big part of this since the beginning. The media is very uncritical and wants to tell this story. It's much more popular to tell a story about how AGI is imminent. So we have like Kevin Roose at the New York Times has a book coming out about AGI, and so he wants it to be true, and everything that he writes is sort of in hopes that it's true. He's not really writing objective journalism. He's actually a columnist, but people don't understand that distinction. And he's got this vision. He wants to sell this vision. Thomas Friedman the same way now. So there's a lot of incentive to say, hey, we're in this really important moment in history. The media often repeats the CEOs of OpenAI, etc., without any question whatsoever what they're saying. Or Jeff Hinton was repeated saying, all the jobs are going to disappear, which is a form of hype, right? And I just read a piece about him in Entrepreneur Magazine, and it didn't even mention that he predicted that all radiology jobs would disappear by 2021. There was no accountability to the past history. So the media has played a big role, and I'll just wrap up. Money has played a big role too. So people have investments at stake. They want to make it sound like these things are great so that they can get the next round of investment. So there's a lot of dynamic, and I think the money and media dynamics are much stronger than they have been before. And so I think that reinforces everything, or makes everything that Rod is describing even more potent and dangerous right now.
And you can criticize the media for it, but then there's also people whose job it is to do this. Science fiction writers and movies about AI have been around for longer than AI, and that's also contributes to the hype. People often have learned or think they've learned about this through science fiction, where the job is to hype it up in some sense, and that's not as I don't think to be criticized. That's sort of what the whole goal is of science fiction.
Tom, do you want to add anything?
I guess, I think academics also have motivation to hype things, because that's how they recruit students, raise money for their research, and so on. So while we're talking many, many orders of magnitude less than what Gary was mentioning, I have yet to see any academic who gets $100 million or $1 billion or $10 billion grants. But there's some of the same dynamic at work, even in the academic community.
So, but Tom, why does it matter if AI gets hyped? Doesn't every new technology require strong selling to get people to invest in it and adopt it? So what's the problem?
Well, I think it's a long list, and it may be the other panelists will help. But I guess the biggest risk is the misallocation of resources. If you really think, I mean, the premise of OpenAI and some of these other companies is that they are going to produce a single sort of all-encompassing technology that will revolutionize everything. And they have thereby attracted billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in investment. Is that really the best use of our investment funds? There's also the question of what we should be regulating. A lot of the focus in regulation has been about preventing some sort of artificial superintelligence from taking over, as opposed to maybe more concrete problems of privacy, security, and correctness, liability, say in medicine or law. So we've also seen companies, particularly I think the leadership in companies, really drinking this Kool-Aid and forcing all of their employees to use AI. And that's going to, because the technology is not very mature, that's going to lead to a lot of people being very unhappy and will actually prevent the technology from being used appropriately when it is more mature.
I was, I guess, going to address this question in a moment, but I'll jump in now. I think it's worth emphasizing that all of us on the panel actually really like AI, right? We're kind of disgusted by the hype, and we think it's having negative consequences on the field of research of AI. All of us were brought into the field because we were interested in the research questions. I think all of us care about money to, greater, lesser degrees, but we were really fundamentally driven by a set of research questions. And I think one of the biggest ways that this hype is perverting things is it's perverting the research landscape. And it's also perverting the policy landscape, as Tom was pointing out. So in the research landscape, it makes it very hard to do something that isn't an LLM thing. If you're building a company and it isn't an LLM thing, they say, why aren't you working on LLMs? And you try to patiently explain, but many of them are not really, technically conversant enough to understand the limitations, which goes back to one of Rod's earlier points. Or if you're trying to get grants and it's not LLMs, it becomes harder. And then on the policy side, as Tom said, a lot of it then is built around these fantasies. So another fantasy I think Tom didn't mention explicitly is the whole race with China. If it turns out that LLMs are actually the answer, which I don't think any of us on the panel really think it is, then that race is going to be a tie. And so we're putting all of this money into a race that cannot even be won because everybody just has the same recipes. And so just, it's up to the size of the servers and everybody's competing on the side of the server. There's not even going to be a victory, but all this policy is made around what in that case isn't a winnable war. It might be a winnable war if it's not LLMs, but that would require researching other things, but that doesn't fit in the narrative that, a lot of people who are well endowed economically are trying to sell. And so it really perverts both research and the policy.
So, Peter, can you reflect a bit more about what happened in the past hype cycles of AI? Rodney mentioned the perceptron in the late 50s, but also expert systems in the 80s. What happened then? Was it a good or a bad thing for AI research, AI companies, and society at large?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's actually, there is some good, and it's sort of understandable why people hype. There's also what hype really is a mismatch with reality. But on the positive side, on the overblown side, there is an equal danger of sort of a mismatch with reality on the negative side, where people, and that has sort of historically, people talk about this sort of AI winters in artificial intelligence, where everybody believes that the time of artificial intelligence has come and gone, and it's been proven to fail. And sort of, in some sense, that has been what has happened from the hype in the past, is that expectations get overblown, and then inevitably they're not met. And in the long run, people say, oh, I guess, it was a failure. And then you get into periods where there's sort of the opposite effect, where there's not as much funding as there should be, or there's not as many companies investing in it as there should be. And and that's equally a problem. So, you know, when you look at it from that side, then there is the positive of then you need to build up people's expectations again. What we, you know, would be healthy for the field, for the companies, the researchers, for society, if we could keep expectations matching reality much better, and then you wouldn't get these sort of wild sort of swings. And you know, if just to wrap up on this, you know, you also talk about things like, you know, perceptron, but also expert systems from the 1980s. The perception is that that was a failure, and you know that there was an AI winter that came of it. But actually, in reality, expert systems are still there. They're still out there in products. There's, you know, there's the equivalent of expert systems in your dishwashers and microwaves that are basically if-then rules of, if it's a potato, this is how much you should, you know, heat it for, and things like that. A lot of what has, you know, a lot of AI technologies from the past have stopped being considered by the public to be AI, but they're still there. They're still in, you know, and it sort of leads to the some people say that, you know, AI is trying to get computers to do the things they can't do yet. Once they can do it, then it's engineering. And you know, this sort of plays into the hype as it relates to the hype as well, because you know, people forget the past. It's always the new thing, but promises get overinflated, and then you get the sort of trough of under negative hype, I guess, is what I would refer to it. So I think ultimately, even though there is some short-term gain to you know, getting more funding, or getting the, you know, as a CEO, getting the venture capitalists, you know, hooked, you're making a promise that if you don't live up to it, it's gonna, you know, it's gonna come back to bite either you or at least the field in the long run. And so in the long run, it really is a harmful thing to overinflate these expectations.
So,
If I could just,
yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
if I could just step in for a second. The earlier AI winters were basically about funding. So funding dried up after people were disappointed by the results. I think that there's a second risk here. So that might happen again, and particularly if these very high valuations don't pan out. If OpenAI ends up looking like a WeWork, then a lot of people run for the hills, and then investment actually dries up for a while. You know, LLMs are not going to disappear, but the high valuations might. So one side of it is economic and financial. The other side is we're starting to see some public backlash. And I think that the policies of the current administration are actually playing into that. So it's, again, a short-term, long-term thing. The short-term is, well, we won't have any regulation on our companies because we need to catch up with China or whatever, but there are likely to be some fairly bad outcomes. And already the public is feeling like AI is underregulated. So now if we have some massive cyber attack, or some, you know, a whole bunch of driverless cars go wrong in some horrible accident or whatever, the public is going to be really pissed. They're going to feel like we were promised that this was great, and it's not, and it's causing, you know, harm to society, and the government's doing nothing about it. The companies told them not to do anything about it. This is a mess. I would not be surprised if the 2028 election is the first in which AI is really a big issue. Hardly anybody talked about AI in 2024, but I think in 2028, because of labor, and possibly because of overpromising and so forth, AI might actually be a big political issue.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say there are things here now about the current hype that are a bit different from the hype of the 80s or the 50s, which is, first of all, that it's not just hype in the positive sense, as Peter said, but also hype about the risks. And second, there is much more public engagement and use of AI. So those two things make the scenario of the hype and the consequences, I think, a little bit different, so that we cannot really apply or learn from what happened from the past, but we have to understand what the current scenario is. But let me ask one last questions about hype, and then we'll go into other topics about influencing the hype, which is, I'll ask Rodney first. When we talk about AI hype, usually we think about hype around AI software, like LLMs, for example, capabilities. But what about robotics? Is also robotics subject to hype? And if so, what is the biggest topic of hype in robotics?
The biggest topic of hype in robotics right now is humanoid robots. And, you know, I like to compare the hype about LLMs is because it emulates our language, which is very important to us. The hype about humanoids, I think, is driven by having the human form. And the valuations there are crazy. People are promising the humanoid robots will be able to do everything next week, and there'll be quick deployment. I'm in the weird position. I've been building humanoid robots since 1992, and I have actually sold thousands of upper torso humanoid robots. No one else has sold any in the current companies, and that company went bankrupt, by the way. But I'm not bitter. But I think the promise of the human form is people see it and think it will be able to do everything. And I think there's two problems with current humanoids. One is the way they walk is not the way we walk. And so whenever it's about a humanoid robot is about to fall, a lot of energy gets pumped into the system to try and catch its balance. And if it does fall, that kinetic energy has to go somewhere. So the only humanoid robots you see close to people are actually little short ones right now. And people think, oh, we'll just be able to make them bigger. But there's the cube square law, the amount of, as you change the height, the amount of energy goes up with the cube of that. So they're just going to get more dangerous. So we have to have a totally different way of walking for them to be safe. And the second thing is no one has really figured out how to make them dexterous. And there's a lot of money being spent on farms of people showing robots how to do stuff, but I think none of that is demonstrated. That's an effective strategy to this point.
I'll add a third issue, which is situational awareness, common sense reasoning, and so forth. So it's all well and good to have a demo in some factory floor that's been carefully constructed and so forth. But if you really want to bring these things into a home, everybody's home is different, and you have animals running around and little children and skateboards on the floor and so forth. We don't really have the software yet to get humanoid robots to really understand that. Rod is the author of the best-selling, or co-founder of the best-selling robot of all time, the Roomba, which is a domestic robot that actually works in a limited circumstance, but it doesn't promise to do everything in your household in the same way. And it looks like he wanted to say something else.
Over 50 million Roombas have been sold, hundreds of millions of other knockoffs, but they don't promise to do much, and they're small and intrinsically safe because they don't have much kinetic energy in them.
Yeah, and I mean, we should be drawing the distinction though between there are robots, and then there Rod, you talked about humanoid robots as what's being overhyped. I mean, there's definitely an increase in potential, I think, for robotics in general. And you have a new company that you're working on it now. I think people do often ask about whether there's an application that you could do with a humanoid robot that you can't do with a robot that's somehow non-human in form. Like, why 2 arms, why not 3, or why not 1, or why 2 legs, why not 4, or why not wheels? But I think a lot of it is this as Rod started up by saying, the allure of being like us, or to and it's anthropomorphication, or anthropomorphizing robots makes us sort of project a lot of human capabilities onto them, even if they don't have them. They're promising more than they can deliver.
Yeah, to be clear, I think it's a golden age for robotics in general. I just don't think humanoid forms are going to be the winner. We have so much more computation we can put on board. We can run so many neural models and get some awareness around the robot that we couldn't possibly do before. So it really is a golden age. But it's going to be very directed at particular tasks is where it's going to play out.
There's a parallel with the AGI kind of debate, where there's sort of 2 arguments people have. One is, are LLMs useful? And the answer is absolutely yes, not for every purpose, and they have their limitations and so forth. And the other is, are they the sort of all-purpose magic silver bullet that we call AGI, artificial general intelligence? And the answer for now is clearly no. My personal view is that LLMs will never be that. And there's something similar in robotics. Like, one question is, are they going to be more useful and widespread in the next decade? 100%. The other is, are they going to be universal helpers that can do anything in your home or whatever? And the answer is no. So there's a bit of a parallel there.
Yeah, and just to respond briefly to one of the questions from the audience, I think it is useful to think of robots as embodied artificial intelligence. That's autonomous robots. ChatGPT and large language models are disembodied. They don't interact with the world. Now we can put large language models onto robots and then make embodied large language models that can interact with the world. So I just saw that somebody was asking whether we should use the word robot or whether we should call them physically embodied AI. And I think that is a useful way of thinking about it. It's a good autonomous robot is an embodied artificial intelligence.
Yeah, let me just say, then people get the idea that, okay, because you can put an LLM on a robot, that's what everyone should do. I had this, I'm putting robots in warehouses. We have them in warehouses in multiple countries, and they're for fulfillment. And someone from the largest seller of GPUs in the world said, "Why don't you put an LLM on it? And then you can tell the robot to go to aisle 3 and get a tube of toothpaste." And I said, "No, every few hours we get a wave, it's called a wave, of 3,000 orders that have to be on a truck in 2 hours. I'm not going to talk to the robot about it. I'm going to use data processing to push out the instructions." So, it's just not appropriate at scale. It might be fine for a demo. And I'm not saying not ever have LLMs on robots, but it's not the solution to every robotics problem.
Yep.
Let me just throw in one other thing. From talking to Rod over the years, and other people, but primarily from Rod, I learned very much the difference between a demo and a finished product. And I think a lot of what goes on is that someone like Elon Musk shows a demo or figure or something like that. Could be robotics, it can also be AI. And it's easy to make a demo. It's hard to make something production grade in the real world at the scale that you need it. And so partly the difference of demos is like just the instruction that you need. But part is like robustness, doing it throughout the whole world in which you need to do it. And the naive audiences often just don't understand the difference. So like if you look at almost any robot demo and there's a bunch of objects, those objects will be far apart and the robot will pick them up and do something clever with some instructions. Now you do it in the real world where the objects are closer together, for example, and the vision doesn't work as well, the manipulation doesn't work as well. Maybe you have to pick up one object from under another stuff, and suddenly it doesn't work nearly as well. If you just look at a bunch of demos like on YouTube of robots, and you start to develop a sensitivity to like what they do in these sterile environments and what the real world would be like, and there's often a huge gap.
Okay, so now we understand what the hype is around AI, around robotics, and so on. But and we also understood and talked a little bit about what generates this hype. But let's go a little bit deeper in that. So, Tom, the perception of AI and possibly also the hype is also influenced by experimental results of tests of AI behaviors. So what do you think has been the influence, for example, of the Turing test or also of modern performance tests for AI systems?
Well, I think it really comes back to a bit of what we've been saying. The Turing test was originally called the imitation game, and it really rewarded people who could imitate human behavior, or computer programs that could imitate human behavior, including human flaws and typos and things like this. And if we look at what statistical machine learning is, it is essentially a technology for training a system to imitate its training data. And so in the case of the Turing test, systems were able to pass the Turing test in quite strictly, and yet were completely useless because the underlying system didn't actually have a very deep understanding of the world. And similarly, we see with these large language models that they can easily pass the Turing test and do all kinds of wonderful language behavior. But in some sense, they're missing the underlying causal structure of the world. And I think the fundamental problem is that they're built on statistical learning. And let's make it clear, my entire career has been devoted to studying statistical machine learning. And so it's a kind of bitter pill to realize that it is also the source of a lot of the shortcomings. A good example, so I think of statistical learning as essentially like a correlation seeking tool, or I sometimes call it an information seeking missile. It looks for correlations between the inputs and the outputs in the data that's being used to train the system. And there was a very nice demo of where this goes wrong, where a computer vision system was shown images of wolves and images of dogs and was asked to distinguish between them. But the wolves were all photographed against a snowy background, the dogs against green grass or green forest. And the machine learning algorithm, of course, the simplest, easiest correlation to find was, oh, if there's snow, well, the computer doesn't know it's snow, but that white stuff in the background, wolf, green stuff in the background, dog. And so the problem is that a correlation is not causation. And it's been very hard to discipline our machine learning algorithms to only learn causal relationships. In computer vision, we're often able to do this by detecting and cropping out the background so that it only gets to see the dog or the wolf. But each new case requires more intervention like that, and we don't have any technique that really scales. So I think we've been playing, statistical learning has been playing the imitation game at scale, and we still don't have ways of learning underlying causal invariance.
Thank you. Anybody wants to chime in?
100% agree.
But Gary, so you know that Apple, and you wrote about it, of course, recently published this paper, by now kind of, very visible, but also very controversial, called The Illusion of Reasoning, showing that LLMs have issues reasoning about simple problems, and these issues increase with the complexity of the problem instance. So is this kind of analysis useful to give a realistic expectation of the capabilities of current AI systems?
There's no way to understand the capabilities except to do empirical research. I don't think it's a perfect paper. And in a way, I don't think it's a surprising paper because there are other papers from Rao and from my own work over the years and so forth that showed similar results. This one was much more popular, and that's actually important. It was much more popular because Apple published it. But I think the general conclusion of the paper is right, that these systems are not really doing at least what I would call reasoning. If they're not very robust, maybe another way of putting it is they're not very robust at executing algorithms. So, one of the clearest examples in the paper was Tower of Hanoi, which is a simple game with 3 pegs and a bunch of rings. And if a human learns the algorithm, they can do it with a problem of arbitrary size, more or less. We could talk about memory and attention and so forth. But these machines could do it for 7, and then they failed at 8 rings, which should not be that hard. And there was this paper called The Illusion of Thinking that tried to make it sound like this was a limit on the number of tokens, but it's not actually an output limitation on the system, right? The problem with 8 disks only requires 255 steps. They easily could have put the output there, and they didn't. And that shows you that you don't really know what they're doing. And it's also an engineering issue, right? If you think that you've tested your system on a small version of the problem and it's going to work on the large version of the problem, if you have a genuine recursive algorithm, you can actually be confident you can do verification and proof or whatever. With these systems, you really can't, and you really don't know. The broadest limit, and I see Rod wants to go, I'll just wrap it up. The broadest limit that's at the core of their paper is really what many of us now call distribution shift. And it's been something that I've harped on throughout my career, which is these systems are very good when things are close enough to what they've been trained on, but they struggle when things get further away. And what counts as further away is more complicated with earlier models. And in fact, we can't even tell from the outside. But all of the failures that we see, or many of the failures that we see over and over again, are really about generalizing beyond the distribution. And it goes to Tom's point about statistical learning. There may be some form of statistical learning that we develop that has more causal understanding. But the way that we're doing now is really between very low level features. And that's never given us the robustness to generalize as much as we should.
Yeah. So before I give the word to Rodney, let me correct what I said, because I said the paper was titled The Illusion of Reasoning, while the title is The Illusion of Thinking, of course. And so just want for the audience to be correct so that they can find it if they didn't see it already. Rodney, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about LLMs and people's perception of them a little. LLMs have gotten rid of or struck at the intellectual basis of a lot of stuff, and it was surprising. Turing test, okay, it passed the Turing test. That was a surprise. It became the Chinese room, which was a common thinking tool about understanding language. And it is the Chinese room, and it just showed up uninvited. And the third one is linguistics and the work on from Chomsky, and that there has to be this innate structure to learn language, and the LLMs don't have that innate structure. So there's questions. But at the same time, I think people who understand and who work in AI don't think that LLMs have intent. but somehow they want to find a way that they are reasoning through language. So that's that, and I don't know whether the rest of the panel agrees. Do academics ever think that LLMs have intent? I'm not so sure. Tom, they do think
Well,
that?
I mean, I think if you give them a prompt, you can try to give them intent, right? Y- and obviously this whole move toward agentic systems, which is more or less programs written using LLMs as components, the intent comes from the designer and the user, not from the LLM itself. I mean, the LLM is sort of a transducer between that and behavior, right?
Yes.
But
There's some confusion about this in the AI safety literature, where people are starting to write about how the LLMs are trying to deceive people and so forth. And I think a more correct way of interpreting that is they know from their training data lots of cases where humans have deceived one another, for example. And what they're doing is essentially they're pastiching text together that they've seen before. And we could have an argument about that. But I think that as a rough approximation, they're pastiching things they've seen before, and they've seen people lying. They have seen science fiction stories about computers not shutting down and so forth. So I don't think they're intending to lie to the user or to resist shutting down, but they will say stuff like that, and it does pose a practical problem, right? Even if there isn't any intent, even if you take out the anthropomorphic understanding of them, which I think you should, I think people should not anthropomorphize them, you still have a practical problem that they don't do the things that we ask them to do. My view is that LLMs will never be fully aligned with human intent, and that that's a serious problem. One way that this is manifested is people now write these system prompts, which is a prompt that the user doesn't see because it's executed before every session or every query, whatever. And they have things like, don't tell the user how to make biological weapons, but that they can easily be jailbroken. They don't treat that as a logical constraint the way that a classic constraint satisfaction system would work. It's just a bunch more text that sort of primes this text and not that text and whatever. Or they're told don't use copyrighted materials or don't hallucinate, but they don't actually have the deep conceptual understanding to follow those system prompts. And so there is a huge problem of alignment, even if there isn't literal intent. But just the way the system works out, doing its pastiching, means that it doesn't always align with what it's been told.
Right. And I mean, this tendency of people of anthropomorphizing AI is very present, especially now that AI can write, for example, like a human being. And this is a reality, is not, then depends why it writes like a human being, what is behind that, then we can discuss. And we know that it's not reasoning similar to a human being, but the tendency of anthropomorphizing really makes people think that it has also all the other characteristics of human beings. So it knows the truth, but it tells you something else. So it's a lie, but it's not a lie because the LLM doesn't know the truth, right? So Peter, how would you see this as playing a big role in this problem with AI hype, and does it generate over trust in AI?
Yeah, it's a great way of thinking of it. Is as people, we need to generalize about other people. When I meet a new person, it makes sense that I should get a small amount of data about that person and then generalize that because I know people in general, I'm going to be able to predict what they do. We leverage this. We give 16-year-olds driver's licenses after a 10-minute road test because we know that it's a human driving. They have. I mean, we can argue about whether they're safe drivers afterwards, but we know it's a person. They have a brain. They perceive like us. We ascribe personhood to them and then generalize aggressively, and we need to do that. And it goes back to what we were just talking about as well. If somebody says something to you that indicates that they have a survival instinct, we assume that they do have a survival instinct because they're like a person. But it's very natural for us then, when something presents to us as human-like, for us to use this same kind of reasoning or same kind of response, even though it isn't human. So it would be a mistake for us to watch an autonomous car driving for 10 minutes safely and then give it a driver's license, right? And the car companies, thankfully, are Waymo did 6 months of testing on the streets of Austin before they put the first person inside. But it is a tendency for people when they see something that looks human-like to anthropomorphize and then trust very, very much that it will be. And like I say, I think it is a rational response for us when we are dealing with real people, but when we apply it to non-people, it can lead us astray very quickly. And I think that does play a big role here.
Yeah, and I think that's partly because people do generalize very smoothly, right? So if you see that they're driving safely for the first 15 minutes, it's very safe to extrapolate that to other situations. But our software systems do not have that behavior, and you know, it's been described as sort of jagged intelligence or jagged knowledge, and it's very easy to end up in a situation where the systems do the wrong thing. I think this also relates to how we evaluate our AI systems, right? When we evaluate humans, we have these intelligence tests where we measure a very small fraction of behaviors, often very artificial ones, and then extrapolate to say, well, these people will, you know, are very intelligent and will do very well with more training and so on. But I sort of make the analogy that, you know, you can estimate the strength of a person by measuring their biceps, but measuring those biceps of a robot doesn't really tell you anything about its strength, right? And it's the same failure, that the underlying causal link between the test you're giving and the true task is missing in these AI systems.
As a result, I mean, there are people who are, I think, you know, saying that there should be very strong, I don't know, either legislation or regulations or something that makes it so that people can very visibly detect when something is an autonomous agent, be it you know, a chatbot or an autonomous car or something like that. That you can tell visibly that it's not a human behind the wheel, but it's an autonomous car, because you want to bring different predictions to how it's going to behave. And you know, and same thing with large language models. If you think you're talking to a person, then you may and you're not, you may respond inappropriately. And so, you know, I think it is reasonable that people are saying it should be very clear to you when you're talking to a person and when you're talking to a large language model, so you can predict appropriately.
Tom, so there is also another article published recently titled AI as a Normal Technology. And this article claims that it will take many years for AI to be adopted in industry successfully and in a useful way, while many companies think the opposite, that AI is ready to be used, to be deployed in many internal processes and also solutions for their clients. So do you think that this mismatch is generated by AI hype? And if so, why and by whom?
Well, so yes, I think that hype is playing a role here. As I said before, I've heard executives in companies talking about some problem and saying, well, when AGI is achieved, then this problem will be solved. And they have magical faith that AGI will somehow solve all kinds of problems. But I think what the sort of normal technology article argues is that, like all previous technologies, it takes 10 to 20 years between the sort of creation of the technology and how and our figuring out how to use it. You know, Kurzweil talked about the idea of a technological singularity, meaning that the change happens so fast that we can't see what happens afterwards. But in some sense, every new technology poses a little miniature singularity in that we don't really understand. So you know, when the people on this call were all graduate students, well, Peter's younger, but the TCP/IP protocols for the internet were rolled out, and we sort of said, okay, we have finished computer networking. We can move files from any computer to any other computer. But we had no idea that social media would be invented and that it would replace traditional media. And have all kinds of other large-scale social impacts. So I think it's very hard to know what will be the most effective ways to deploy AI technology. Now, some companies we could view what they're doing as exploring, trying to find out what will work and what won't work. And I think we will be engaged in that technological exploration. we need to have our eyes wide open about the limitations of the technology. But when management says you will all use this technology, they're asking for trouble, because the truth is that it probably will only really have a strong business case in a fraction of the aspects, and will really require re-engineering the whole corporation and maybe all of its procedures. So the vision that it's somehow a pluggable replacement for a human worker is completely wrong, and is going to get companies into a lot of trouble.
I think one way of thinking of this too is that it's going to happen sector by sector, right? It's not going to be the raw large language model, Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, that transforms the supply chain management industry or manufacturing or sales. There's going to be a domain expert from that industry that knows the pain points, and that then becomes, that works together with an AI expert or becomes conversant in AI, and goes through this years long process of generating and coming up with new versions of and fine-tuning software that is good for that industry. That will take years to happen, I believe.
There's a whole I'll just say one sentence. There's a lot of notion out there of magical thinking, that AI is magic, and in going with that magic is the notion it'll be instantaneous. Every sector, every problem, and it's just not real.
I just want to, some of the big companies have said we're going to replace our programmers with language-based systems. And at my company, we use LLM systems for some programming techniques, a very specific way, and it's been very good actually for particular things. I could say that in more detail. But this has long been the dream. When Fortran came out, formula translation, the idea was it would get rid of programmers, because you just write down a formula and the program would happen. That was the first, mainstream compiler for science. And it didn't get rid of programmers. It just brought lots more programmers on. So there's always a goal. This new technology is going to solve every piece of my problem. I'm in San Francisco, whole lot of, we had cruise vehicles, and then Waymos up the wazoo, and Zooks a little bit. They're everywhere. But I started a few years ago asking every Uber driver, have you ever had to clean up vomit in the back seat? And they said, oh, yeah. Saturday nights, I got to clean up vomit. And people, saying, oh, we'll have these cars that do everything, but they're not going to clean up the vomit. So there's more stuff than meets the eye in every job. And I think that gets lost.
Okay, so let's see now what we can do about this mismatch between AI perception and reality. So let's start with Rod, because you have been publishing several predictions on AI and robots' capabilities, and then you regularly check this prediction every year on January 1st. Should we institutionalize this kind of initiative for the whole of AI, or is it challenging to make them precise enough so that everybody agrees on the results of the yearly check? We asked this question in the community survey, and 59%, so majority, but not really a very high majority of the respondents supported this proposal.
Yeah, so I think Gary mentioned an instance where someone had made an outrageous prediction, which had a real impact, and then now they're making a different prediction later, and they're not held to it. I think we should hold people to it, which is why I did it myself and hold myself to it. But I think there's no motivation for most people to do that, and so people. Unnamed people like Elon Musk, for instance, will continue to make wild predictions about their technology because that's how they keep their valuations of their companies. So I don't think we're going to be able to hold people to it unless we have, a bunch of grumpy old people, like some of us on this call, certainly with me, try to hold people to it, because it's not as exciting. As thinking about the possibilities. It's just not as exciting.
I actually offered Elon Musk $1 million bet on one of his things, and got a little press out of it as an attempt to get the press to care about it. Like the Wall Street Journal picked it up, and it was actually there was some utility in it, I guess, but it didn't stick. Like getting the press to care is what would really matter. If the press systematically held people like this accountable, it would change the conversation. But the press was interested in it for 5 minutes. Oh, this is cute. This guy offered $1 million bet. Obviously, Musk didn't take the bet, and he did. I also offered to debate him. He didn't want to engage. It's not in the interest of people like this to actually engage in what is the accuracy of their predictions over time. It would only be if the press pushed it. Maybe if the public really stood up and said, "We want to understand. Like, are we being lied to?" and made it in the press's interest, maybe that would happen. I think it's great. Rod does those predictions. I put 25 predictions out this year about AI for this year. For what I thought would happen on my Substack. And I think it's good to hold people accountable.
Yeah, I should say not all press people are overhyping. I think I'll bring someone up that I've got great respect for the articles he's been writing for Cade Metz in New York Times. I think they're much more careful than say the columnists in the New York Times about.
Yeah, the day-to-day reporters are better than the columnists in terms of keeping to the facts, I think.
I was going to say earlier, I do think the level of nuance in the press about AI has gone way, way up compared to earlier in my career. It used to be that either AI was going to destroy the world or AI was going to save the world. It was all very polarized. And now I see, in the last 5 years or so, I think there's been many more articles that are more nuanced about, look, there's some positive effects, but there's some risks as well. And here's how we need to balance them. And I think, that the level of discourse around it has been much more, I think has been elevated a lot recently, which I think is good.
I completely agree with that. And I also think that there's still a long way to go towards having the press really hold people accountable.
Agreed.
I don't think we should treat Medium articles as press either. So.
Okay. So yes, Gary, just want to go back to the fact that, you propose this bet and then you regularly publish on your Substack, you engage a lot with other people on X, other social media, so to really, pinpoint the hype, the mismatch, and debunk it through some fact checking. So, and even in the community survey, 78% of the respondents said that there should be a community-driven initiative to counter the hype with fact checking claims about AI. So do you think that this is something feasible, or would be useful and people would listen and read it?
I mean, in principle, maybe. I mean, I sort of feel like sometimes a one-man army doing that. And I get a lot of pushback. I get called a troll and a pest and all of this stuff. It would be maybe nicer if there was a larger institutional effort to do that. I would support it, if people want to do it. I'd be happy to stop doing this if there was a clear, firm, institutional way of doing that.
Yeah, there are also initiatives from the AI community, like the AI Index, for example, that show the current capabilities, and limitations of AI. So, Peter, do you think that these are good and good enough ways to educate all the AI stakeholders about the real AI capabilities of and limitations, or should we think about something else?
Well, so I'm still an active professor. I think everybody else here on the call is emeritus now, but I'm still teaching, and a lot of the teaching I'm doing now, and this is not just me. This is, I think, across the country. It's happening more and more. Is about to the broader community now. So I introduced a course last year that I called AI: The Essentials of AI for Life and Society. It was essentially an AI literacy course that was aimed at the entire university population, people with no computer science background. And I think we're at the point where nobody should graduate from college, from university without having at least one course in artificial intelligence, and even backing that into to high school and middle schools, that it's being conversant about what AI really is, what it isn't, what the risks are, what are the myths. And I think is becoming a fundamental, sort of tool and skill in our society. And we are not, I think we would be dropping the ball as educators if we have people graduating having at least the basic literacy with artificial intelligence. And so I would love for this to be a required course. I've made all the materials for this course available, by the way. They're on my website and anybody can look at them. There's the videos, the assignments that don't require any programming ability or background. And all the reading assignments. And so I would encourage people to look at that. We've gotten great feedback from people on our campus. We also, and going to the next level at UT Austin, we have an online master's now in artificial intelligence at a low price point. It's I think $10,000 to get a master's degree in artificial intelligence for 10 courses. That's also trying to bring allow people in the workforce to upskill. People can take this while they're working, do it in evenings, or they can do it right after college. And we're getting a lot of good feedback on that as well. I think we're at the point where everybody needs to have some degree of literacy, and then we also need to really broaden the pipeline of how we can give people more, at least some of the workforce, deeper skills in AI. But yes, I've also been involved in the AI 100 study, which is related to the AI index. I think all these efforts are just really essential in people from the inside, people who know what AI is, educating, rather than us relying on, as we've said before, science fiction and media. And so, I hope this panel plays a role in that as well.
So I have another question for you, Peter. So you know that AAAI is an association and a conference that covers many areas of AI, not just machine learning related areas, but also symbolic kind of rule-based AI areas. So how is this reflection about the reality of the capabilities and limitation of more modern AI, as some people will call it, leads to the need for the field to encourage a diversity of approaches? So yes, LLM, yes, machine learning, but also other ones, because in the community surveys, 80% of the respondents agreed on the need to educate the public, including the press, the VCs, about the diversity of AI techniques and research areas that sometimes is overlooked and maybe people don't even know about it.
Yeah, this is something I feel really strongly about. I think, the narrative right now, I mean, one of the reasons that we've gotten to where we are right now with the big boom in artificial neural networks is that there was a diversity of approaches. There was a time when many people in the field thought neural networks were never going to work, and they were sort of on a sideline. But the community kept, there was a part of the community that kept it going. The AI world kept a diversity of approaches, including neural networks, and now they're seeing the day in the sun. Ironically, there are now people who benefited from that, who are saying, okay, we won. Now people should only work on neural networks, and we shouldn't do anything else. And I think that's a huge mistake. The whole message of this panel is that there's an overhype, that we do not yet have all the tools and algorithms to do everything, to replicate intelligence fully, to do everything that we would like to be able to do with artificial intelligence. So we do still need to encourage and support people who are looking at ways to combine symbolic methodologies and probabilistic methodologies with neural networks, and support new paradigms that could maybe have a hope of building causal world models, or and causal models and causal understandings of the world, which are still missing. And so I think it's a tendency for people to sort of always jump on the bandwagon and do what everybody else is working on, and so and that's going to happen. I think we need to actively prop up the people who have a taste for trying different things.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to jump off the call, so I'll just say one last thing. Well, first of all, it was a wonderful panel. Thank you for including me. And second of all, I completely agree with what Peter said. And I think one of the worst consequences of hype is that it has yielded an intellectual monoculture. And we really need to pursue other approaches, including, I think, also neurosymbolic AI. I think neurosymbolic AI is quietly ascendant right now. AlphaFold is a neurosymbolic system, alpha proof, alpha geometry. I think we're going, and the use coding at the back end, right? That's symbolic AI that the LLMs create them for themselves and then run through symbolic interpreters. So I think we are getting to where neurosymbolic AI is quietly rising, but this hype has led to a monoculture that has delayed all of that, and that's been a negative consequence. And hopefully we'll move past it. Thank you all very much. Bye bye.
I add one thing. My company where we're deploying robots, I've counted 13 different AI technologies that we use on the robots, including neural enhanced stereo, but VSLAM, geometric path planning, some of them 60 years old. And that's how real systems get built, with lots of different pieces.
Yeah. Okay, so we're getting to the end. We are at top of the hour, but let me ask the panelists if you can share with us a final advice about AI perception versus reality. Tom.
I'm not, I guess my advice is write your Congress people to keep the National Science Foundation funded, because it was in the 1980s when expert systems crashed, and it was only the National Science Foundation that was funding core AI research. And we need that. They invest in a very broad portfolio of technologies, always pushing things forward. And that's very important for our country. I realize that we have international audience as well, but that's an urgent problem here in the United States.
Thanks, Tom. Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with Tom, and just on top of that, I would say if there's, I think, many people in this audience who are already experts in AI, but for those of you who aren't, there are now resources. Educate yourself about the reality, and try to be able to separate out what's what is hype and what is fact. And I think the more conversant and literate people that we have, both among the general public and then also among policymakers, that will also lead to people understanding the need for the basic research and for National Science Foundation that Tom was saying.
And I would say I agree with NSF, not just for AI or computer science. Across all, it's a disaster for research in general. But I would also say to people, don't follow, don't be like a 5-year-old playing soccer where you all get around the same ball, because it's going to be really hard to compete. There's too many people there. Go off and do something different, and you could have a big impact by being different. So be different.
Thanks. Okay, thanks. Let me thank you all the panelists for a very insightful discussion about this topic, which I think it was innovative also compared to other discussions. And I hope it shed some light or given some food for thought for the audience on AI perception versus reality. Thanks also for all of those who joined us and attended this panel. The panel has been recorded and will be available on the AAAI website and also on the AAAI YouTube channel. So thank you all, and hope to see you soon. Bye.